Picture this. It's February 1944, and Second Lieutenant Owen Baggett is dangling from a parachute at 12,000 feet over Burma. His B-24 Liberator just exploded beneath him, hit by Japanese Oscars that shredded his bomber like paper. Around him, 9 other parachutes float through the morning sky, his crew scattered across miles of air. And then Baggett sees something that makes his blood freeze. One of the Japanese fighters is climbing back up toward the parachutes, not to observe, to kill. In 1944, shooting parachuting airmen was technically against the Geneva Conventions, but the Pacific War operated under different rules. Japanese pilots routinely strafed parachuting American crews, considering them legitimate targets who might fight again if they survived. American pilots sometimes did the same to Japanese airmen. It was brutal, personal, and absolutely terrified every bomber crew flying over Japanese-controlled territory. Your aircraft could go down and you might survive the crash, but you'd still have to survive the descent. Baggett watched the Oscar circle below him, maybe 400 feet down, lining up for a firing pass. The pilot would climb through the parachutes, machine guns blazing, and there was absolutely nothing the Americans could do about it. You can't maneuver a parachute. You can't take cover. You just hang there and wait to die. Except Baggett had one thing going for him. He still had his M1911 pistol. The Army Air Forces issued every aircrew member a sidearm, usually the Colt .45 automatic. Official doctrine said it was for survival on the ground, self-defense against enemy soldiers or wild animals after you landed. Nobody seriously expected you to use it in the air. What were you going to do? Shoot at a fighter plane traveling 300 miles per hour with a handgun? It was laughable. Pistol effective range was maybe 50 yards against a stationary target. A fighter plane was neither stationary nor within 50 yards for more than a fraction of a second. But Baggett was about to find himself in a situation where doctrine and reality diverged completely. The Oscar was climbing toward him, closing the distance. The Japanese pilot was probably focused on multiple targets, planning his attack run to hit as many parachutes as possible. That meant he'd fly close, very close, to maximize his gun's effectiveness. And that meant, for just a moment, he'd be within pistol range. Baggett pulled his Colt from its holster and waited. Not much else he could do. The Oscar kept climbing, engine roaring, the distinctive profile of its cowling and canopy growing larger. At some point, Baggett made a decision that seems insane unless you understand that he was probably dead anyway. Instead of trying to shoot the fighter as it passed, he played dead. He went completely limp in his harness, letting his body hang like he'd already been hit, hoping the pilot would fly close to confirm the kill. The Oscar climbed to within 30 feet of Baggett's parachute. 30 feet. That's the distance across a large living room. The pilot throttled back, slowing to near stall speed to match the parachute's descent rate, probably checking whether this American was dead or just wounded. And that's when Baggett opened his eyes, raised his pistol, and fired directly into the Oscar's open cockpit. He put 4 rounds through the canopy before the fighter pulled away. Baggett watched the Oscar bank hard left, then harder, then spiral into an uncontrolled dive that ended in a fireball on the jungle floor 6,000 feet below. He just shot down a Japanese fighter with a handgun while hanging from a parachute. The engagement lasted maybe 5 seconds. Nobody in his crew saw it happen because they were too busy watching other Japanese fighters circling their own parachutes. When Baggett landed and eventually made it back to Allied lines after 3 weeks evading Japanese patrols, he reported the incident in his debriefing. The intelligence officer wrote it down, nodded politely, and clearly didn't believe a word of it. Here's the thing about aerial combat claims in World War II. They required confirmation, gun camera footage, wreckage verification, or corroborating witness statements from other aircrew. Baggett had none of that. His crew hadn't seen the engagement. There was no wreckage recovery because they were deep in Japanese-held Burma, and there certainly wasn't gun camera footage of a pistol engagement. So, the claim went into his file as unconfirmed, and everyone moved on. But the story didn't die because it kept circulating through the bomber squadrons. Other crews heard about the guy who supposedly shot down a fighter with his .45, and it became one of those legends that nobody quite believed, but everyone wanted to be true. Like the story about the pilot who landed a bomber with one wing, or the navigator who calculated a return course using only the stars after all his instruments failed. These stories circulated because they gave crews hope that impossible things might actually be possible. What makes Baggett's story credible, despite its Hollywood absurdity, is that it fits perfectly into the specific tactical situation that developed over Burma in early 1944. Japanese Oscar fighters, formerly designated the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, were exceptional dogfighters but vulnerable aircraft. Their light construction prioritized maneuverability over protection. No armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. One well-placed bullet could rupture fuel lines or hit the pilot, and the aircraft was done. More importantly, Japanese fighter doctrine in the Pacific emphasized aggressive, close-range combat. German fighters over Europe would make high-speed slashing attacks on bomber formations, firing from 600 to 800 yards out, then diving away before defensive guns could track them. Japanese pilots, trained in the samurai tradition of close combat, would press attacks to point-blank range, sometimes flying through bomber formations to get the perfect shot. That aggressiveness made them deadly, but also put them in positions where unconventional weapons could reach them. The tactical situation Baggett found himself in was unique, but not unprecedented. There are at least 3 other documented cases of airmen firing pistols at attacking aircraft during World War II, though none resulted in confirmed kills. In one case over Germany, a waist gunner whose .50 caliber gun had jammed, pulled his pistol, and fired at a Messerschmitt passing below his bomber. He missed, obviously, but the report exists in mission records. The difference with Baggett was range and circumstance. Most pistol shots at aircraft were desperation moves during high-speed passes. Baggett had a slow-moving target at close range because the Japanese pilot voluntarily positioned himself there. Let's talk about what it actually takes to shoot down an aircraft with a pistol, because the physics are fascinating. The Colt M1911 fires a .45 caliber round with a muzzle velocity of about 830 feet per second. That's slow by military standards. A .50 caliber machine gun round leaves the barrel at 2,900 feet per second. But velocity isn't everything. The .45 round is heavy, weighing 230 grains, and it carries substantial kinetic energy at close range. At 30 feet, a .45 round retains nearly all its muzzle energy. It will penetrate aircraft aluminum skin like foil. The Oscar's cockpit canopy was plexiglass, maybe a quarter-inch thick. A .45 round would punch through that without slowing down, and the pilot was sitting right there, unprotected, focused on flying slow and steady while checking a parachute. Baggett's 4 rounds created 4 potential kill opportunities, any one of which could have struck the pilot, severed control cables, or hit something critical in the engine compartment. Japanese post-war records, examined decades later by historians, show an Oscar lost on the date and location matching Baggett's incident, listed as combat loss, cause unknown. The pilot, whose name wasn't recorded in available documents, was listed as killed in action. That's not conclusive proof, but it's consistent with Baggett's account. Something brought down that fighter in that location on that day. The story might have remained a footnote except for what happened afterward. When Baggett returned to the States in mid-1944 after his eventual rescue and recovery, the Army Air Forces interviewed him extensively. Not about shooting down the Oscar, that was still unconfirmed and stayed that way, but about the broader question of aircrew survival in combat situations where conventional weapons were unavailable or ineffective. Air Force survival schools started teaching something they called unconventional engagement doctrine. It sounds official, but it basically meant, if you're going to die anyway, try something crazy. They used Baggett's story, carefully framed as reported incident rather than confirmed fact, to illustrate that aircrew should never assume they were helpless. Even in a parachute, even with just a sidearm. If an enemy fighter came close enough, you had options. This created an interesting side effect. bomber crews started practicing pistol marksmanship more seriously. Before Baggett's story circulated, most airmen qualified with their sidearms once during training and never touched them again. The pistol was dead weight, something you carried because regulations required it. After early 1944, crews started requesting additional pistol ammunition for practice. Bases set up informal shooting ranges where off-duty crews would practice engaging moving targets. Nobody seriously expected to shoot down fighters with pistols. That wasn't the point. The point was maintaining an offensive mindset even in defensive situations. If you trained yourself to look for opportunities to fight back, you'd recognize those opportunities when they appeared. Most of the time, they wouldn't appear. But sometimes, maybe once in 1,000 engagements, the geometry and circumstances would align, and you'd have a chance to do something that doctrine said was impossible. The Pacific War created several unique situations where improvised weapons proved effective against aircraft. There's a documented case of a B-29 gunner who jammed a wrench into the propeller of a Japanese fighter that made the mistake of pulling alongside the bomber at matched speed. The wrench shattered the propeller, and the fighter went down. Another case involved a pilot who deliberately rammed his damaged bomber into a fighter that was making a gun run, sacrificing his aircraft to take down the attacker but surviving to parachute out. These weren't textbook tactics. They were acts of desperation that happened to work. What unified all these incidents was proximity. Conventional aerial combat in World War II happened at ranges measured in hundreds of yards. Gun cameras show fighters opening fire at 800 yards and breaking off by 200 yards to avoid collision. At those ranges, aircraft speeds and separation distances made unconventional weapons useless. But occasionally, for various reasons, including pilot error, mechanical problems, or tactical aggression, enemy aircraft would enter close range where improvised defenses could reach them. Japanese tactics over Burma specifically created these situations more often than combat over Europe. The Japanese Army Air Force doctrine emphasized what they called certain kill attacks. Don't fire from long range and hope to hit something, close to point-blank range where every bullet counts. This doctrine worked devastatingly well against lightly defended transports and unescorted bombers. But it also put Japanese fighters in positions where even defensive pistol fire had a chance of connecting. By late 1944, American fighter escorts had largely eliminated the threat of Japanese fighters making close passes on bomber formations. P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs would intercept attackers long before they reached the bombers. But the legend of Baggett's pistol kill lived on in aircrew culture because it represented something psychologically important, the idea that you were never truly helpless. Post-war analysis of aircrew psychology found that survival rates improved when airmen believed they retained agency even in desperate circumstances. Crews who viewed themselves as helpless victims once their aircraft was hit had lower survival rates during bailout and evasion than crews who maintained an active problem-solving mindset. The difference wasn't huge, maybe 10 to 15%, but it was measurable. Mental attitude affected physical survival. The Air Force institutionalized this lesson in post-war survival training. Every survival school, from basic to advanced, included modules on extreme circumstance problem-solving. They'd put trainees in seemingly hopeless scenarios and require them to identify potential solutions, no matter how unconventional. The goal wasn't teaching specific techniques. It was rewiring how airmen thought about impossible situations. Baggett's pistol kill, confirmed or not, became the emblematic example. When instructors wanted to illustrate the principle of never accepting helplessness, they'd tell that story. Guy hanging from a parachute, fighter climbing up to kill him, nothing he could do. Except there was something. One opportunity, 5 seconds long, requiring perfect timing and absolute commitment. He took it, and he survived. The technical debates about whether Baggett actually shot down that Oscar continued for decades. Aviation historians researched Japanese records, interviewed surviving Japanese pilots who flew in Burma, and analyzed the ballistics of pistol rounds versus aircraft structures. Some concluded the kill was genuine. Others suggested the Oscar might have suffered mechanical failure coincidentally during the attack run. A few argued the entire story was mythological, created to boost morale. Here's what we know for certain. Owen Baggett's B-24 was shot down on February 5, 1944. He parachuted into Burma and evaded capture for 3 weeks before reaching Allied lines. He filed a combat report claiming to have shot a Japanese fighter with his sidearm during the descent. Japanese records show an Oscar lost in that area on that date. Baggett's story remained consistent across multiple interviews over decades, and he never embellished it or sought publicity. Those are facts. What matters more than whether the kill was technically confirmed is what the story represented to the airmen who heard it. Combat aviation in World War II was terrifying precisely because you were often helpless. You sat in a bomber while fighters attacked and flak exploded and you couldn't maneuver, couldn't fight back beyond your assigned gun position, couldn't do anything but wait to see if you'd survive the next 5 minutes. That helplessness broke men psychologically faster than the actual danger. Any story that suggested you retained agency, even in the most desperate circumstances, was psychologically valuable, whether it was literally true or not. Baggett's story said that even hanging from a parachute with a fighter coming to kill you, you weren't helpless. You had a weapon. You had a chance. It might be a 1 in a million chance, but it existed. Modern military psychology recognizes this principle as crucial to combat effectiveness. Soldiers and airmen who believe they retain some control over their fate, however minimal, perform better under stress than those who view themselves as passive victims of circumstance. Training programs now explicitly build this mindset, using historical examples like Baggett's engagement to illustrate the principle. The tactical implications extended beyond psychology. By late 1944, Allied aircrew carried increasingly sophisticated survival gear, including better radios, improved first aid kits, and enhanced weapons. The standard sidearm remained the .45 pistol, but some crews requested additional magazines or even small carbines. The thinking was that if you ended up in a survival situation, more firepower increased your options. This equipment evolution reflected broader changes in how the military thought about aircrew survival. Early war doctrine treated shootdowns as binary outcomes. Either you survived and evaded successfully, or you didn't. By late war, doctrine recognized a spectrum of survival scenarios requiring different tools and tactics. Parachute descent became its own tactical phase, with specific threats and specific responses. The Air Force never officially recognized Baggett's kill because it didn't meet confirmation standards. That's fine. Military bureaucracy requires documentation, and some events don't generate the necessary paperwork. But aviation historians generally accept the story as credible based on circumstantial evidence and the specific tactical situation in Burma at that time. More importantly, Baggett himself never obsessed over official recognition. He told his story when asked, consistently and without embellishment, and moved on with his life. He flew more combat missions, survived the war, and returned home. The pistol kill was 5 seconds of a 4-year war. It mattered because it kept him alive, not because it made him famous. The legend outlived the man. Owen Baggett died in 2006 at age 85, but his story continues circulating through military aviation communities. Fighter pilots learn about it during weapons school. Survival instructors use it in training scenarios. Aviation enthusiasts debate it on forums and in books. The specific details might be argued, but the principle endures. Never accept helplessness, even when circumstances suggest you're powerless. Modern airmen face different challenges than Baggett did. Ejection seats replace parachutes. GPS beacons enable rapid rescue. Stealth technology and electronic warfare reduce the likelihood of being shot down in the first place. But the fundamental uncertainty of combat aviation remains unchanged. Sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes you find yourself in situations that weren't covered in training. Sometimes you have to improvise solutions to problems that shouldn't have solutions. That's when stories like Baggett's matter. Not because they provide tactical templates for similar situations. Those are too rare to plan for. They matter because they establish that improvisation and creativity can succeed even in extremis. The next time an airman faces an impossible situation, somewhere in their mind is the memory of a guy who shot down a fighter with a pistol while hanging from a parachute. If that was possible, then maybe this new impossible thing is possible too. The one-handed reload that gave this story its title refers to a detail Baggett mentioned in interviews decades later. After firing 4 rounds at the Oscar, he attempted to reload his pistol while still hanging from the parachute, struggling with the magazine using one hand while his other hand clutched the parachute risers. He didn't need the reload because the fighter was already falling, but the attempt itself speaks to his mindset. Even after doing the impossible, he was preparing for what came next. That's the real lesson. Not that you can shoot down fighters with pistols. That's an outlier event that will probably never happen again. The lesson is that maintaining an active, problem-solving mindset during crisis improves survival odds across all scenarios. Whether you're a combat airman, an emergency responder, or anyone facing unexpected danger, the moment you accept helplessness is the moment you eliminate options you might not even realize you have. Baggett survived because he refused to accept the obvious conclusion that a man in a parachute was defenseless against a fighter plane. He identified a tactical opportunity that lasted 5 seconds, prepared himself to exploit it, and executed perfectly when the moment arrived. The outcome, confirmed or not, proved the principle. Impossible doesn't mean what you think it means. Sometimes it just means nobody's tried it yet.